I invaded Charlestown back in April of 2022 on a nice spring day. Located about 15 miles northeast from downtown Louisville, there's actually a lot to talk about with this town despite it being pretty small. We're going to start with talking about the massive former ammunition plant site, followed by some history of the town itself. In the end, I'll be giving Charlestown a Chris Livability score, so make sure to stay tuned for that. We start the video on the south end of town, as this is where the old Indiana Army ammunition plant site is. To the left you can see the few remaining buildings of the original complex. Today when you drive along Highway 62 you wouldn't be able to tell that anything was here, as the entire site has been demolished. I have clear memories of driving by back in 2008 when I was first learning how to drive. I would sometimes skip school and just go out and drive once I had a car and a license. Real story. And a few of those times I would drive past on this stretch right here. And whenever I wasn't looking out for cops, as back then this stretch of highway was a speed trap, I would be looking at what was a giant abandoned facility, and I would be wondering what it used to be. And as we're looking at some of these older Google Street View photos, keep in mind that a good portion of this complex was already demolished in 2013. The Indiana Army Ammunition Plant was a massive site consisting of 18,169.41 acres to be exact. Just to illustrate how big that was when everything was completed, there were as many as 1,700 buildings, 190 miles of roads, and 92 miles of railroad tracks on the property. Within the property, there were three main areas, or plants, on the site. And the first area was built in 1940 to help with World War II as a smokeless powder plant. It was called the Indiana Ordnance Works Plant 1. Smokeless powder was the primary explosive propellant for ammunition during that time. Officials decided to build the plant here due to it being in close proximity to the Ohio River, which provided it with the water that the plant would need to operate. Most of the land was being unused at the time, and there weren't that many people that lived in close proximity, so at the time it made sense to put it here. There were still a few countryside churches and some homes and farms that the U.S. had to purchase, including this house here, which still stood in 1941, 1 year after construction started on the massive plant. There were about 60 families that were forced to move. Interestingly enough, there were some cave openings on the land. However, the Army destroyed the caves in case there was an opening outside of the plant property, so that way there weren't any kind of secret underground passages to get inside the Army's property. Now, obviously, the plant was funded by Congress, as the sole purpose of the plant was to be able to provide the United States with ammunition during World War II. This was the largest plant of its kind in the world when it was being constructed, and in order to get things rolling fast, there were as many as 30,000 temporary workers at any given time during construction of the plant. When the plant was being built, Charlestown had only 939 residents. However, due to the thousands of workers that the plant saw, the population soared to 4,785 by the 1950 census count, a growth rate of about 400%. And according to this article from blog.history.in.gov/World War II comes to Indiana, a resident of Charlestown in 1940 talked to the Indianapolis Times and described Charlestown as being an easygoing upland town, just one of those southern Indiana towns where rambling homes line the shaded streets and the still peace of the afternoon is like Sunday. Well, the rapid increase in a new population due to the plant needing all of the workers brought with it a huge culture shock to the town. Well, after the Indiana Ordnance Plant 1 was completed, the construction continued, as in 1941, the feds brought in the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company to create a bag-loading plant known as the Hoosier Ordnance Plant. It was in full operation by the end of that year. Here, workers would pack smokeless powder into silk bags. But with as many as 30,000 temporary construction workers in town at any given time, Charlestown saw a housing crisis, as there were only 235 homes and one hotel in town. Indianapolis newspapers said that the temporary workers would live in trailers, cars, even chicken coops, and of all places, the town jail. Even more problems came up, as the infrastructure in Charlestown couldn't handle 30,000 new people. There wasn't even a public water supply at the time, as everyone drew their water from privately owned wells, so the area was not ready for 30,000 new people to come through to help build this facility and work there once things opened. There wasn't any garbage pickup either, so as a result, health became a huge concern as locals feared that an epidemic would break out. The town jail was even closed by the state due to sanitation concerns, as many of the workers were living there. As a result, many of the workers had to live in nearby cities such as Jeffersonville, Clarksville, and even Louisville. They say that peak employment hit in 1942 when there were as many as 50,000 workers here. Some of them were in-factory workers, and some of them were construction workers, as construction never really stopped here when it was in peak operation from 1941 to 1945. And in fact, when construction did slow down a little bit, a lot of the construction workers then started working inside of the factory so that they could keep a job. According to this article here from the Clark County Library, the peak employment of construction workers was 27,000, and the peak employment for Indiana Ordnance Works Plant 1 was 9,400, the Hoosier Ordnance Plant was 8,900, and Indiana Ordnance Works Plant 2 had about 17,500 workers on the site during construction. Additionally, some of the construction workers were German prisoners of war. Anyway, moving on now, as it was all a very short-lived time that the Indiana Army ammunition plant was operated under its original purpose. Construction on the Indiana Ordnance Works Plant 2 began in 1944, and the construction of this plant was never completed as the Japanese surrendered on August 13, 1945. Once the news came through, workers were told to lay down their tools and go clock out, and that they would be notified when it was time to pick up their final check. In between World War II and today, the site has had a very complicated history. Once the war ended, all three of the plants were combined, and it was no longer called the Indiana Army Ammunition Plant. Rather, it was renamed to Indiana Arsenal. The federal government then sold the property that the Indiana Ordnance Works Plant 2 sat on, which included 5,000 acres. In 1950, the chemical giant DuPont was contracted by the government to make solutions for agricultural purposes. In 1953, the plant went back to supplying ammunition during the Korean War, which lasted until 1957. Peak employment during that time was about 8,000, so nothing near what it saw during World War II. In 1959, Liberty Powder Defense Corporation took over the management of the remaining facilities as it continued to produce supplies for the Vietnam War. 67 acres were given to Clark County for the Clark County Fair in 1960, while another 1,600 acres of the property were sold in 1963. Over the years, the site continued to change names and hands in ownership and be sold off in small portions over the next several decades. In 1996, 1,125 acres were sold, which eventually became Charlestown State Park. More acres were given to the state park over the years, and today, Charlestown State Park consists of 4,000 acres. In 1994, an environmental cleanup program began, and it was determined to have been completed in 2006. In 2004, many of the old structures were demolished, and September 2016 was the end of federal ownership of the property. Today, there's been developments of newer industrial warehouses and other facilities, which provide thousands of jobs, making it the largest employment area in all of Clark County, Indiana. But since the site was so massive, you can still see many of the old streets that were made for the old ammunition plant. And even though I drove on some of them back in the spring of 2022, you can no longer drive your car on the streets that I did in this video, as they are now blocked off. Lastly, here's a blueprint of the site where everything was located. North is pointed left on this map, with Indiana Ordnance Plant 2 being on the northern end of the property. Indiana Ordnance Plant 1 made up the middle portion, and the southern portion belonged to the Hoosier Ordnance Plant. Charlestown State Park now takes up a good portion of the property along the Ohio River, and unfortunately, many of the old streets that led to some of the potential remnants of the Indiana Army Ammunition Plant are blocked off to the public. It appears on Google Satellite View that you could possibly access some neat things from Charlestown State Park, but like I said, they have it all blocked off to the public. When it comes to flying the drone, with Charlestown State Park being in the state of Indiana, you're not allowed to fly a drone at state parks in Indiana without prior authorization from the proper authorities, and that is a pain in the neck to try to get. There's several no trespassing signs all over the place around here, so I could really only find a place to fly it on the far southern end of the property, and really you just get a glimpse of how empty the place is, and you can still see a lot of the original streets. And I guess it's actually in the central portion of the property rather than the far southern end, but yeah, you get it. Next up is Charlestown State Park, which once again was created from land that was once owned by the Indiana Army ammunition plant. Apparently, this land was never developed, even though it was owned by the feds for about half a century. But with it being along the Ohio River, it makes for some good recreational access for the public. 14 Mile Creek runs through the state park, creating some steep elevation changes as it winds its way to the Ohio River. There's even some remnants of the old Rose Island theme park deep inside the park, but it's quite a hike to get there, and someone who was with me didn't want to walk that far. Someone forgot to bring their tennis shoes. Rose Island was really popular in the 1920s as people would come by on a ferry from Louisville. The 1937 Ohio River flood, however, wiped out the theme park and it closed for good. One might assume that the theme park closed because of the Indiana Army ammunition plant, but no, it was actually the Ohio River flood of 1937, which destroyed many towns along its path. Anyway, all that's left of Rose Island is stone pillars, metal archways, a stone fountain, and a swimming pool, but you've got to admit, it's still neat that there's remnants of it after all of these years. Rose Island first developed in 1881, and it quickly grew as a popular hangout spot for people from the city. At its peak, there were 135,000 people who would visit Rose Island on a yearly basis. Now, it was tough to find history on the town of Charlestown itself, as anytime you look up Charlestown's history, you'll mostly find stuff about the Indiana Army ammunition plant. Charlestown, however, was founded by Charles Beggs in 1808, who gave the area its original survey. Additionally, the first Indiana governor, Jonathan Jennings, made Charlestown his home after moving from New Jersey. This is Charlestown High School, home of the Pirates. Niche.com rates it slightly above average. However, stay tuned until the end where I'll talk more about the quality of the schools when I give Charlestown a Chris Livability score. Now, Charlestown has never had much of an economy outside of the Indiana Army ammunition plant. Despite the new warehouses and other industry being developed on the former property, high-paying jobs are pretty rare to find in the Louisville area, let alone Charlestown, which is kind of isolated from the rest of the Louisville metro area. From here, it's about a 20-minute or so drive during rush hour to get to downtown Louisville, maybe 30 if you want to avoid the tolled bridges. With that said, we're now going to move on and talk about the economic stats for Charlestown. The median household income in Charlestown is $58,000 per year, which isn't terrible, but it's also not great. Only 20% of adults 25 and older hold a bachelor's degree or higher, which is 13% lower than the national average rate, and 8% lower than that for the entire state. The median value of owner-occupied housing units is $142,000, while the poverty rate is 14%. On the other hand, the crime rates here in Charlestown are nothing to be concerned with, as the violent crime rate is less than half of that for the national average, and the property crime rate is as well. We're now going to head south on State Highway 3, which is the main drag through town. As we head through, you'll see that Charlestown doesn't really look like a suburb of Louisville, rather it more so looks like an isolated rural small southern Indiana town. If you head north and look at towns like Scottsburg, North Vernon, Austin, or Crothersville, add Charlestown into the mix, and none of these towns look much different. Another thing that Charlestown shares with those other places is that there aren't too many amenities to choose from in town when it comes to either retail or restaurants. Basically, you have your fast food and gas station chains, a few dollar stores, and a couple of low-end grocery stores with a few exceptions here and there, but that's about it. Also, most towns the size of Charlestown in southern Indiana have a Walmart. However, Charlestown does not. Now, most of us know that that's actually a positive, as most of us know what kind of gas bags you can find there. Anyway, the only difference for Charlestown is that it's only a 15-minute drive or so to get to Clarksville, which has plenty of shopping. Up ahead, though, we'll be in downtown Charlestown, so stay tuned to see what that looks like. Alright, so it's now that time, people. You can't always trust a 20-some-year-old surgeon, and you can't always trust a 40-year-old virgin, but you can always trust Chris's livability score. When it comes to the education, it's not terrible, but it's not great. Other high schools in the Louisville metro area do better. As many as 38% of high school students here are a part of economically disadvantaged families, and scores in math and reading are slightly below the state average. Although it's not terrible, it gets a 10 out of 20. Crime in Charlestown is a non-issue. Just stay away from the meth in town and you'll be fine. It gets a 17 out of 20. Next up is downtown, and downtown Charlestown is okay. We're driving around it right now, and it has a few shops and restaurants, plus some buildings that give it some character, but it could be better. It gets an 11 out of 20. Economy is next, and I'm not a fan of Louisville's economy. Only one Fortune 500 company is headquartered in the area. Louisville is historically reliant on manufacturing and hardly anything else. And with Charlestown being pretty far away from the rest of the Louisville metro area, you would have to drive pretty far before you get to downtown or any of the other office complexes in the Louisville area. I mean, there's plenty of industrial jobs available nearby, especially with the development taking place at the site of the former ammunition plant, but that's about it. Economy gets a 6 out of 20. Up next is recreation, and recreational opportunities are far and few in between in Charlestown. You can hike on some trails at Charlestown State Park and put a canoe in the Ohio River, I guess, but that's about it. It gets a 7 out of 20. Now, the history of Charlestown is fascinating. You know, Netflix could put together a docuseries on everything that's happened here. It gets a 17 out of 20. Amenities are lacking in many areas. As I mentioned earlier in the video, you have very little outside of a few cheap fast food chains and discount stores. If you want more, you have to drive 15 minutes to Clarksville. So amenities gets a 9 out of 20. And if it was any further away from Clarksville, it probably would get a 5 out of 20. Now, cost of living is not an issue here at all. In fact, it's the best thing about the place. It gets a 19 out of 20. All in all, the Chris livability score for Charlestown, Indiana is 96 out of 160, putting it in a three-way tie for 5th place out of all of the cities that I've done this for so far. Final thoughts here, as Charlestown's biggest strengths are definitely its history. Without it, the Chris livability score probably would have been in the low 80s. You might wonder why history is so relevant, and the reason why I would say so is because it gives a place some character and uniqueness. Head north to the town of Scottsburg and they have nothing on Charlestown. The only thing that town can hang their hat on is being labeled as Indiana's Redneck Riviera. Well, anyway, history drives the interest in a town, which can create future economic opportunities if the town decides to take advantage of it. History can also drive tourism, so it might be hard to see the benefits of a town having a strong history, but in my opinion, it's a good strength to have, and it gives locals a more fulfilling sense of pride to tell people where they come from. Well, with that said, if I were forced to live in the Louisville metro area, and I would really have to be forced to live in this area, I might choose New Albany over Charlestown, or St. Matthews on the Kentucky side, or anywhere on the snobby northeast side of Louisville, as that suits my fancy a little bit better than Charlestown does. The reason being is that I personally would like to be closer to some higher-end amenities than what Charlestown currently offers. Maybe in the future things around here will change in that category, but for now, I would feel pretty comfortable in leaving Charlestown off of my list of places that I would live in the area. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't like this place, but I just think the town could do more to embrace its history, and I think that having a better selection of amenities could really draw some people in. It seems like on the days where you don't feel like driving anywhere crazy, that you can get bored here really quick, as there probably isn't much to do other than get a Mountain Dew from the Dollar General with some Doritos, and get online and complain on social media about all the things you hate in modern society. That's what happens when you live in a town where everything closes at 5 p.m. And don't tell me that Taco Bell is open until 2 a.m. because that doesn't count. Well, with that said, I do end the video here. And do me a favor, as if you enjoyed this video, make sure to drop a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, as doing all of those things helps these videos destroy the evil monster that is the YouTube algorithm. Also, make sure to hit that notification bell and select yes so that you can be notified every time that I upload a new video. If you enjoyed this video, then you might enjoy checking out some of the featured playlists on this channel. Videos with amazing insights on other places like what you saw here can be found in my Louisville playlist or in my Indiana playlist. Last but not least, if you can't get enough of me on here, you can always go follow me on my other social media accounts, and those links are below. We'll see you next time. Peace.